Okay, so I'm also going to talk about vehicles, but not quite as advanced as the Bloodhound, unfortunately, and definitely no rockets. So in 2009, I left my job as a management consultant in London to move here to the coast of Kenya. A pretty stark contrast from life in the city. So here I work with a forestry company helping them build tree farms with local farmers. And perhaps surprisingly, the biggest challenge in this new environment wasn't the work or the culture or the food, it was getting around. The vast majority of public transport was incredibly inefficient, and most times I struggled to get around. Thinking about this more, there were four kind of big issues undermining the transport system. First, the roads. So in many rural areas, this is what roads look like, highly degraded dirt tracks. And after it rains, they essentially become impassable for most vehicles. Certainly in some cities and highways, the road infrastructure is improving, but the scale of the problem is monumental. And the majority of rural and peri-urban road environments lack the necessary government investment to become functional. So second, isolated communities. Outside of the major city, most people live tens of kilometers apart. This, for scale, is one community in an area stretching thousands of acres in rural Kenya. And third, low average income levels. 56% of people in Africa live on less than $5,000 per year as a family. 24% on less than $2,000. That's $5 per day per family. And in isolated communities like this, people earn even less. So people can't afford to own a vehicle at this income level, but they can typically afford to pay a small passenger fare if public transport's available. And fourth, the vehicles themselves, the vast majority of which are imported from international markets where they're designed for consumers like you or I with very different usage demands. And because high import duties, cars are also relatively expensive. For context, most people in Kenya buy 7-year-old pre-owned sedans like this at $10,000 or more. So to illustrate the impact of weak transportation, let me introduce the Karura family. This is Jeremiah and Mary and their family of 6 children who live in the Ngong Hills in Kenya. And this is their son, Samuel. So Samuel's 11 years old and goes to primary school 7 kilometers away. Because he doesn't have access to public transport, that's a 14-kilometer round-trip walk every day. Imagine walking 14 kilometers every day back and forth to get to work. For those of you who live in West London, that's the same distances from here at Tobacco Dock to Hammersmith every single day. So this is just a quick snapshot of Samuel's life. At 6 a.m., he wakes up, gets ready to go to school. At 6:30, he sets off on the 7-kilometer walk to school across the local countryside. This is just a brief time-lapse of his journey. As you can see, it's not a terribly interesting walk and takes about 1.5 hours each way, so that's a 3-hour round trip of wasted time. Unproductive time is shown in gray in a timeline here. And although sometimes Sam is joined by his friends en route, all in all, this is a complete waste of time just to get to school each morning. At 8, he starts school for a productive day of learning. Productive time is shown in blue, and then finishes the day to walk back home on the same journey before playing football with his friends really briefly, before having to walk another few kilometers to collect the family goats grazing in the nearby farmland, herding those goats back to the homestead, and then around sundown, 7:30, doing his homework, having dinner with the family, and then going to bed around 10 p.m. So this is his normal day, and he's not alone. I mean, a lot of other people in these regions face the same kinds of transport challenges. Take Sam's mum, Mary. So most mornings, Mary wakes up and takes the goats out to pasture, and then she walks for 3 hours to collect clean drinking water from the nearest community well before spending the rest of the day cooking and cleaning and generally taking care of the home. And finally, Sam's father, Jeremiah. So he wakes up really early to till the family farm in preparation for planting season, waits typically for up to an hour for an unreliable bus service to arrive, which then takes him to the nearest town where he can collect supplies, maybe sometimes see the doctor, and usually go to the local market before again returning on this 1.5-hour journey back to the home and spending the rest of the day herding the goats back with Sam and having dinner and relaxing with the family. So if you aggregate the wasted time of in this case, Jeremiah and Mary, it's 3 hours every day spent either waiting for unreliable public transport or just walking in the absence of any kind of transport at all. And for Sam, it's even worse, 4 hours every day. And if we compare Sam to a typical kid in the West, another 11-year-old, that contrast becomes a bit clearer. And if we look at them side by side, we can look at a few examples of that. So firstly, the walk. Sam walks 3 hours round trip every day, whereas a kid in the West typically has access to a safe, reliable, and regular bus service to take him to and from school. And whereas Sam only has half an hour to play with his friends, a kid in the West is typically fresh from a quick bus ride and has much more time in the afternoon for soccer or chess or whatever else they're interested in. And finally, whereas Sam is spending more time helping out the family with a family farm, a kid in the West has much more time to rest. So there's a big difference here, about 4 hours of wasted time versus 1.5 hours. That's a 2.5-hour difference every single day in wasted time, which over a year is about 912 hours, or 38 days, or 5.4 weeks of additional wasted time. So the key impediment to Africa's transport network are the vehicles themselves. And to illustrate this, we can just look at a few of the popular modes of public transport in countries like Kenya today. First, the minivans. So minivans have good storage and good terrain coverage, but for most consumers, they're prohibitively expensive and often overloaded and overcrowded to justify return on investment. And then there are sedans and station wagons, which are much more affordable, but limited in cargo capacity and not really designed for rough road driving in rural areas. Then there are auto rickshaws, which are more affordable still, but essentially restricted to urban terrain only, fuel inefficient and uncomfortable to ride in. And finally, motorbikes, which are much more affordable, very popular in rural areas, but essentially unsafe and unstable when driving on uneven terrain. For those of you who hadn't spotted it, under this floating white blanket is a baby. It's not common to have 4 people or more with infants and heavy cargo traveling on motorbikes in rural parts of Kenya, so it's also a big safety issue. Obviously, it's not just Kenya. Across Africa, hundreds of millions of people remain relatively immobile without access to appropriate forms of transport. Bad roads, low income levels, weak vehicle alternatives, and high import duties all undermine the transport system and ultimately constrain economic productivity. Despite this, though, the Pan-African economy is booming. Currently, it's about $1.6 trillion per year in GDP and growing. The key constraint to this is the network of vehicles themselves. So this is a massive commercial opportunity and a massive social opportunity as well. This is the reason I founded Mobius, to build Africa's first mass-market car brand. And this is where we started, in humble beginnings in a 400-square-foot shed on the coast of Kenya in a town called Kilifi. This is where we built our first ever vehicle. It was a really small, humble space with just enough room to house one vehicle chassis. After we did this, we moved operations to Mombasa, where we built our next generation vehicle, Mobius 2. This was still a really crude prototype, but a big step forwards for the company, with a bigger team, better equipment, and generally a more intensive development process. So once we'd finished this car, we decided it'd be fun to drive around Kenya for a few weeks and test and market the car. So we covered thousands of kilometers in all kinds of road environments and demonstrated the product to hundreds of consumers who would often flock around the car as we arrived in local town. In 2012, as the business continued to grow, we moved operations from Mombasa to Nairobi. This is our flagship showroom and headquarters, a much larger space able to accommodate a growing team as we expanded. This is also where we developed our next iteration of Mobius 2, the alpha test version, which we built in our R&D shop over the next few months. So the testing of Mobius 2 alpha was much more rigorous than the previous prototype. Here we did tens of thousands of kilometers of testing. This was actually an airstrip in Kenya where we did a lot of our high-speed vehicle dynamics testing on the car. And as we built this vehicle, we also in parallel developed a production-ready version of the car. We set up a local supply chain. This was for exhaust, seats, electrical harnesses, as well as a global supply chain with vendors in India, China, Europe, and South Africa. We defined a detailed production process end-to-end, as well as all the tools necessary to build this thing consistently in a production environment. This is one of the sub-assembly jigs for a side structure of the chassis. We set up a factory with a local partner in Kenya and built our first pilot production vehicle last year. So this is Mobius 2 Pilot. It's a highly durable, off-road capable car, able to traverse really degraded, uneven roads reliably. We engineered the vehicle specifically to deal with really heavy loading, common amongst a lot of local consumers in Kenya. A really robust monocoque chassis, 260 millimeters of ground clearance, able to get over rocks and uneven terrain, and custom-developed suspension able to handle rough road driving. So the core design principle of Mobius 2 was really to simplify the vehicle as much as possible. We eliminated all the non-essential features in the overall aesthetic, the configuration of subcomponents, the choice and positioning of all the fasteners in the vehicle, everything we looked to simplify. So we're selling this car today in Kenya at $11,000. To put that in context, that's 5 times less than an average SUV in Kenya, and the same kind of price as a 7-year-old sedan car in country. The kind of conception of the car was around taking all the non-essential features in a vehicle and eliminating them. So we'd move back to the drawing board to reimagine the vehicle around design principles geared towards the typical African consumer. To us, that was really low-cost, high-function vehicles designed for purpose with only the key features that people would pay for. We also wanted to make the car aspirational, though. So beyond just making a new car versus a used car, we aimed to create a really rugged aesthetic and core performance that just essentially outcompeted the alternative. We wanted people to want to drive this and to be really proud to own it. The interior was further simplified, as I mentioned, to minimize cost and weight, and also to maximize relevant utility. So on the right here, these rear seats fold and remove to create an open flatbed storage area. And we're really focusing sale on middle-income buyers. So these are people earning between $10,000 to $20,000 per year in household income. This is the driving force of most automotive spending today in countries like Kenya. And within that group, really kind of entrepreneurs. So some of you here know the entrepreneurial potential in Africa. We're empowering that with vehicles that enable entrepreneurs to run transport businesses to many more end users in their communities. Mobius is more than just building better cars. We're looking to build a platform for mobility. And because entrepreneurs can plug in different features into the vehicle, like a goods cage or fridge, with the right idea, it's not just public transport that they can operate, but goods delivery services, school bus services, and mobile medical care. So we're focusing on middle-income buyers who in turn provide services to lower-income end users and fueling a profitable cycle of wealth creation. This is our long-term goal for economic growth. Take an entrepreneur like David. So today, David owns a motorbike and runs a public transport business in his local community, picking up passengers, dropping them at their destination, and then collecting a small fare. But his passenger capacity is limited, and the maintenance costs of running this vehicle are relatively high, so his profit's limited. With a Mobius vehicle, purchased with access to bank financing, David can expand the scope of his business with more passengers, a wider route, and generally lower repair and maintenance costs. These are exactly the kind of people we aim to serve, and we've now moved one step closer with the launch of full production operations of this car in Kenya. So there are 3 main phases. First, body shop, where we manufacture the chassis and the body panels of the vehicle using standardized tools from essentially raw materials. The next phase is the paint shop, where we treat and paint the panels of the vehicle and the chassis. The one color available today is black, matte black. The third phase is assembly, where we connect all the different components into the vehicle in a relatively manual process at the moment. We're looking to automate increasingly in the next few years, but right now it's very manual. We have an embedded quality team through the production process, so they check the vehicle at different stages in the assembly process to make sure it meets our standards before the car is ready for delivery to pre-order customers. And so again, by targeting customers like David, who can extend the range, the scale, the efficiency of their transport businesses, and by selling more of these vehicles in the region, we aim to change the transport network across Kenya, so that kids like Samuel can access much more effective forms of transport and save hours every single day getting around. And long-term, we aim to expand outside of Kenya, across East Africa, and eventually the whole continent to mobilize many more millions of people who otherwise suffer from the same kinds of challenges of immobility we saw earlier. Now, the economic potential of this is massive when you consider the productive labor force across the continent, some 500 million people. Even if only 1/10 of those people benefit from the kinds of transport services we're talking about here, that's an aggregate time saving of over 35 billion hours every single year, 35 billion hours. And if you consider the local labor rate, that's an equivalent value of about $43 billion in unrealized economic potential. As a GDP, that's higher than 100 countries in the world. This is a massive opportunity. So transport is absolutely fundamental to logistics, to trade, to social services, to access to education and healthcare and markets. But something in the West we take generally for granted because it works. In Africa, it's a different story, though. Transportation grid to physical economies is essentially the same as the internet to virtual economies. The long-term vision of Mobius is to weave our products into the fabric of the growing African economy to eventually mass-produce these vehicles and mobilize the continent. There's obviously a long way to go, though, and this is a bold vision. We've only just started, so if you're interested, get in touch. Thank you.